Good morning from Brighton. As the Labour conference opens, Britain faces warnings of a really tough winter ahead. Food shortages, rising energy bills and the removal of benefits from the poorest. You might think a perfect springboard for a left-wing opposition party. But this morning, Labour is divided and there are mutterings about whether its leader, Sir Keir Starmer, can really cut through and win back the pile of seats he needs to win power in the next general election. And time may be shorter than many of us thought, because Boris Johnson is giving himself the freedom to call that election whenever he wants. I'll be joined live this morning down at Brighton Beach by Sir Keir Starmer. And as the government dramatically backtracks over inviting in foreign drivers to try to solve the HGV crisis, I'll be talking to the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. Plus, reacting to rumours the government's about to take unilateral action over the Irish border problem, I'll be speaking live to the EU Commissioner, Mairead McGuiness. A pretty massive morning for politics in the papers. To review today's news, I'm joined by Toynbee of The Guardian and our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. But first to Salford and the news headlines from Ben Thompson.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning. More than 10,000 lorry drivers and poultry workers will be given temporary UK visas in a government U-turn that's designed to stop supply disruption ahead of Christmas. It comes after a lack of drivers led to fuel shortages at petrol stations and empty shelves in supermarkets. The British Chambers of Commerce said the latest announcement was like throwing a thimble of water on a bonfire. A man has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of a female teacher found dead in a London park last week. Sabina Nessa left her home in South London on September the 17th to meet a friend, but never arrived. Her body was found the following afternoon. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has reaffirmed his party's commitment to ending the charitable status of private schools in England, a policy which could raise an estimated £1.7 billion a year. In the latest pledge during Labour's conference in Brighton, Sir Keir said the money raised from removing the tax breaks would be spent on ensuring all pupils left school ready for work and ready for life. And millions of voters are going to the polls in Germany in an election to decide who will take over from Angela Merkel as Chancellor. Officials say millions of people have cast their ballot by post in this year's elections. The race to replace Ms Merkel is expected to be tight, and there are likely to be lengthy and fractious coalition negotiations. That's all from me for now. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. But Andrew, back to you in Brighton.
Many thanks. Now to review the papers, as I said, Toynbee and Adam Fleming, but the front pages, almost every paper refers to the big crisis over HGV drivers and shortages of petrol. But two normally Labour-supporting papers are interesting. The Observer reads, Starmer faces a wave of anger over Labour conference chaos. And the Sunday Mirror has Labour's preferred announcement of the morning, Sir Keir, I will tax private schools to help poorer kids. Now, they have spoken before about this, but what we learned today is that they'd raise £1.7 billion from removing the charitable status of private schools. No doubt some private schools will get into real trouble because of that, and there are many more announcements from the Labour Party already this morning. Adam.
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to look at, though, is that, as you mentioned, that front page of the Observer, because the thing about Labour Party conference is before you get into the arguments about policy, you've got the arguments about procedure.
About the Labour Party itself, yes.
Yes, and that's what we've had the last few days. How do you change the rules for the leadership election, and also what are the rules for individual MPs being deselected by their local party? Keir Starmer has had to water down the first to get the second.
So why is that so important? Is it that Labour MPs have been looking over their shoulders for too long, worried about their own activists, can't concentrate on the job? Is that the argument?
That's absolutely it in a nutshell. It means they'll have more time to go out campaigning and talk to people on the doorstep rather than worrying about what's happening in their local constituency party.
Polly, a Labour conference wouldn't be a Labour conference without a row between the Labour leader and the NEC at some point, and at the beginning of it normally. What does Keir Starmer have to do this week?
He's got to establish who he is. He's had no time really to talk to the people during the pandemic. It hasn't been a very bad time to be the opposition leader.
It's only 18 months and it's all been COVID.
It's all been COVID, and it's been no chance to meet people in person. In his speech, he needs to establish who he is. He's not a lawyer in a suit. He's going to be saying, he's a man from a working class background. His father was a toolmaker, mother was a nurse, and they're shouting out there, where's the opposition? Well, that's what he needs to do. He needs to say, we are the opposition, this is what we stand for. We're going to see a raft of quite radical policies this week. There's been a lot of complaint that it's been policy light until now. You mentioned the private schools, but also what Angela Rayner had to say was very important about effectively wages councils, where wages will be set right across sectors. That will hugely transform a lot of working people's lives.
We'll be talking across the course of the programme about the policy changes, but essentially we are seeing the Labour Party moving a bit more to the left than perhaps we had expected.
I think so. The idea that it was kind of Blair light, I don't think so. I think when you see the policies laid out, that's going to be the story.
Lots more of that to come. Adam, as I said earlier on, it's the lorry driver crisis that's been dominating a lot of front pages. Boris Johnson has a real problem. On the one hand, he wants to stop importing so many, as it were, cheaper lorry drivers from overseas, and on the other, he has to drive up the wages of British lorry drivers and get them back on the roads.
Yeah, and you can see on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph where it says Johnson demands pay rise for truckers. In the medium and long term, that's the government's preferred solution, that truck driving becomes a more attractive, well-paid job, so you get more people going into it in the UK, a new generation of truckers. But in the short term, to avoid the shelves going empty, they're having to issue thousands and thousands of temporary visas.
The British Retail Consortium says there are 10 days to save Christmas. Slightly lurid language, but the government has to move very fast.
Well, remember last week there was 10 days to save the poultry industry when there was a shortage of CO2. And guess what? There was a very small, quick bailout for the factory that makes the CO2.
There's rather a nice Telegraph cartoon on the forecourt there saying we're banning panic buying, only nonchalant drivers can buy petrol from now on. Yeah. Polly, Telegraph also has a really important story about the lowest income families to be hit by these energy bills. Now, they're losing money, a lot of these families, on the cuts to the increase in national insurance and the cuts to universal credit. But there's also now £300, the Telegraph estimates, on ordinary families' energy bills this winter.
Particularly interesting is in the Telegraph, because an awful lot of Tory backbenchers are very worried about this, those famous red wallers. They can see a cost of living crisis that is enormous. I mean, those hard-working people, all parties talk about, on low incomes, are going to get hit very hard by the universal credit cut and by the energy prices. The energy price cut, according to that story, will be 16% off the incomes of low-paid people, only 1% of high-paid people. It really is hitting people in a very disproportionate way, and the lowest-paid people on the lowest income are going to be hit hardest.
Hit hardest. Of course, this is really hard for the government, Adam, because this was a temporary uplift, was it, originally on universal credit, and Boris Johnson argues it would cost, I think, £5 to £6 billion, presumably on income tax or another tax, to replace it or to make it permanent. So these are genuinely hard choices the government coming into this winter having to make.
Well, this government learning a lesson that all governments learn eventually, which is it's very easy to introduce things where you spend money, but very hard to take them away because of the howls of pain that people genuinely feel. Lots of speculation in Whitehall that there could be a little technical fix around this, where maybe the rate at which your universal credit is withdrawn as you earn more money from work, they would reduce that, so actually put a bit more money back in people's pockets, but not the full £20.
Staying with economics, I guess the biggest single story this morning is Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, giving an interview to the Sunday Times, where she's coming out with a whole raft of policies, which it seems to me make a big change from the John McDonnell-Corbyn years.
Makes a big change, I think, from both those years and also from the Brown years. It's much less steel handcuffs she's put on herself than Brown did, but on the other hand has set a pretty firm benchmark for not overspending, Labour not being trusted with the public finances. And I think she sets quite a strong case for that, but also a wealth tax. Now, there's a new thing.
That's a really interesting thing, because she's saying we're not going to raise income tax, I promise that, but that leaves very few opportunities for raising large amounts of money if you don't go for a wealth tax, which is something that almost all the Labour conference wants, but Labour leaders have historically shied away from.
But not this time. She's going to go for it. She's going to say how unfair that we tax capital gains tax, that landlords are taxed less, that people with shares are taxed less. They should all be taxed at the same level as income tax, which is, of course, what Lord Lawson did when he was Chancellor. So, you know, Tories have had that view too.
Adam, that she actually says there's going to be no magic money tree. Now, that is a famous phrase because that was used against the last Labour Party leadership. And she is saying explicitly, therefore, it's going to be different.
Although, ironically, that phrase is what some people think lost Theresa May the election when she said it on the eve of polling day. I think what's interesting about that Rachel Reeves announcement, there's lots of technicalities that the Institute for Fiscal Studies and people will pore over. But one of the big pledges is Labour would get the national debt down. They don't say when. They're leaving themselves some room.
Or by how much.
Exactly.
It's about 100% of GDP at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
All parties always say that. This government's promising that. Whether they achieve it or not, it's up in the air.
Really, since about 1945, the Labour Party has been allegedly gunning for private schools, saying they're going to do something about it. And decade after decade after decade, they never have. Now, this morning, according to the Mirror, they are promising to remove the charitable status of private schools, which would net them, if it works, £1.7 billion. How big a change is that for Labour Party policy?
It's hugely symbolic. It really matters. It goes to the heart of inequality. During the pandemic, the gap between private school educated and state educated hugely expanded. And what Keir Starmer said in his pamphlet, this much mocked long pamphlet this week, was that he wanted to spend that money on making sure that state school children get the same amounts of arts, music, sport, and, you know, trips out, which the private schools get.
So big ambitions. I mean, the statement that they're going to go for the charitable status isn't new, and we don't know for sure about the amount of money. But nonetheless, they're harder-edged about this, and they seem to be meaning it more this week than they have before.
It is continuity Corbyn, though. This is what Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell wanted to do. But I wonder, will that be enough to quell the very left-wing activists in Labour who accuse Keir Starmer of jettisoning lots of Corbyn-era policies? Or is this maybe just enough to say, well, no, I'm not ditching them all?
So here we are, we're about to interview Keir Starmer. We've had big rows inside the Labour Party. There'll be a week of people storming up and down from rostrums and crowds and shouting. We've heard a bit of shouting already today. One former Labour MP, Dennis McShane, has written a book about whether Labour can ever win an election again. And in that book, he makes a very interesting suggestion that they ditch the conference altogether. He said it doesn't win us anything, it doesn't help us, it costs a lot of money. Why do we do it? Let's stop doing it.
I'm sure every leader will have wanted to do that. But given how difficult it was even to slightly change the election system, I can't imagine that actually happening. I mean, in some ways, it's a wonderful thing, a conference, where people all come together, particularly after 2 years of not having one, and meet each other again. And a lot of the fringe meetings are really exciting and interesting. It's not all fights from the far left. Actually, there's quite a hive of ideas going on here. And I think that's true in all conferences.
In all conferences. You're quite right, Polly. We all know that conferences, the secret is they're great fun to be at. They're great fun to enjoy. Thanks both very much indeed. Adam, you're going to come and join us right at the end to discuss Keir Starmer's interview. But for now, thanks both very much indeed. And so to the weather. Now, if weather could be described ever as torpid, this would be a torpid day. Lugubrious, slow-moving, grey, slightly too warm. We're deep into the season of mists, mellow fruitfulness and forecourt panic buying. Over to Ben Rich in the Weather Centre. Ben.
Hi there, Andrew. Thank you. Good morning. We are going to pick up the pace, actually, weather-wise, over the next few days. Some windier weather to come, some cooler autumn weather on the way as well. But we've got some of the mist and mellow fruitfulness around this morning. In fact, some quite dense patches of fog just at the moment across some southern parts of England, some for eastern England as well. Those visibility issues should improve. And then actually, for England, Wales, eastern Scotland, it's largely dry with patchy cloud and sunny spells, just the odd rogue shower. But western Scotland will see cloud and rain spreading in later. That rain certainly getting in across Northern Ireland, really setting in actually through the middle part of the afternoon. Some heavy bursts, quite a brisk wind, but temperatures above where they should be, 18 to 22 degrees. Now that band of rain in the west will work eastwards overnight with some really heavy bursts and some squally gusty winds embedded as well. Quite a mild night in prospect. However, as we push this band of rain eastwards tomorrow, it will leave us with something cooler as it clears. So a wet start in eastern areas, that will clear, then it's sunshine and showers. Some of the showers heavy and thundery, but temperatures lower than they have been, a much fresher feel. And we stick with that cooler, fresher feel as we head through the week. We'll see showers or longer spells of rain. It'll often be windy, much cooler as well, feeling much more autumnal. Andrew.
And that for me is good news. Now, Britain has plenty of petrol, but not necessarily in the right places. The petrol stations all around the country. Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, joins me now. Grant Shapps, do you agree with Brian Madison, who's chairman of the Petrol Retailers Association, talking about the immediate situation? He says this situation is going to get worse before it gets better. Is he right?
Well, actually, it depends on how people respond. And obviously, we've got a massive package of different alleviations in place. There is plenty of fuel. I've checked with the 6 refineries and 47 storage centres we have in this country, and we're not short of fuel, as you rightly described. It's just about the panic buying, which is preventing it from being available sometimes immediately as you want it. And we're seeing these queues which don't need to be there. So this package, which deals with the short term, with things like visas, and I'm calling in the army to help process more DVSA, that's the licensing itself, to get that through the short term, and then the longer term, which is big reform of the sector that's required, because there's been a systemic shortage of drivers across the whole of the economy, made much, much worse by coronavirus across the whole of the world.
The British Retail Consortium says you have 10 days to act now to save Christmas for people. You've talked about the long term. These overseas drivers aren't going to come in until October. It takes time to train more drivers. It takes time to persuade drivers to leave retirement and come back. Are you going to have to bring in army drivers in the short term?
Yeah, I was going to say, fortunately, we've actually been since April, and the fundamental problem was caused by no testing taking place during the lockdown, where we couldn't do that. Since April, it reopened, and since then, we've doubled the capacity to test new HGV drivers compared with before coronavirus. So there are more people already coming into the marketplace. I've then made some further changes over the summer, including changing the law to simplify the driving test and well, not actually lower the standards in any way, I should point out immediately, but to make it administratively more straightforward. And that's bringing more people in as well. So some of these things are already happening. As I say, this is a big package.
Just to my question, Minister,
today.
I'm sorry, just to my question. Are you going to bring in army drivers?
Well, we'll do whatever's required. The army are going to, at the moment, as I say, make sure that we're testing HGV drivers, and that's where the bottleneck is. But this is a big package today, which includes apprenticeships and boot camps and better paying conditions for people. What we're asking for is, on top of that package, is for the public to do their part. Only top up when you only fill up when you need to. Don't top up at all. Just fill up when you need to. And then there's actually plenty of petrol to go around. This is an unnecessary situation where there are queues that are forming, even though we have all the fuel that we need in the refineries and storage centres in the UK.
On Friday, you told us that you weren't going to bring in foreign workers, and now you are. So perhaps, on my calculations, by Tuesday, you might be announcing army drivers being used on the roads of Britain.
Well, I've said all along, we'll do whatever we need to do to make sure that things flow in this country. That's what you'd expect us to do. It is unfortunate, and you're right. We don't want to be relying on overseas labour in the longer run, which is why this is limited to Christmas, because we've got to sort out these long-term problems with our HGV sector, which has been around for years, by the way. I'm afraid the thing which has sparked this particular sort of rush on the petrol stations is some fairly irresponsible briefing from one of the road haulage associations, which seems to have got this going. As I say, there is.
Sorry, you're blaming the road haulage association. You're blaming the road haulage association for spreading panic. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I see in the newspapers this morning that they briefed out from a meeting that they attended. One of the features of the situation we're in is there's been a shortage for a very long time. So this is nothing new. But as soon as you say to people, there's a shortage, people tend to react, and it's not required. There's plenty of petrol in the country, as I say. If we all go back to buying petrol as we would normally buy petrol, this big package is going to do some things in the short term. And as you point out, I'm doing some things that we wouldn't necessarily have wanted to do because we believe in fixing this market for the long term so that the drivers are paid better. And we welcome that. We think it's a good idea for drivers to be paid more and the conditions are better.
Let me ask you about the foreign drivers you're bringing in. You're saying 5,000 visas for drivers, but conditions for HGV drivers on the continent are better than they are here, and you're only offering them about 11 or 12 weeks' work before they have to go back again. Are you sure you're going to get enough of them coming over?
Yes, the key thing about this is if you look at, for example, with the distribution to petrol stations, the shortage of drivers is a much smaller number, 300 drivers. So we're not talking about the 5,000 for that. That's also for the food sector as well. So as I say, there isn't a dramatic shortage in drivers. In fact, it's been like this for a long time. It's only if you create a situation where people start to queue, other people see the queue, and on it goes. Fortunately, when it comes to tanks of petrol in people's cars, unlike, for example, toilet rolls or pasta at the beginning of coronavirus, there's only so many places that you can only store a single tank of petrol. You can't then store it elsewhere very easily. So this will resolve itself. But I'm very keen to put in place this massive package of measures today to make sure that people are reassured. And in return, we're asking people to be sensible, only fill up when your car actually needs filling up, and this would then resolve itself.
Now, you acknowledge in a newspaper article today that part of the story, nothing like all of the story, but part of the story is exacerbated by Brexit. I thought the whole point of Brexit was that at crises like these, the government hung tough and ensured that wages were driven up by not bringing in foreign workers. That's what you said a few days ago, and now you're doing the opposite.
Yeah. One of the things about Brexit is it gives us the flexibility to set our own rules, in this case, produce some visas, because I don't want to see these queues at all, and we want things to flow normally, so that gives us the freedom to do it. On the other side of Brexit, it's actually given me a lot of freedom to get on with expanding the number of tests available, which is the real constriction here, at the DVSA, who do the testing people. And those are changes that I couldn't have made if we were still in Europe, because the way that the licenses operated were all set by European directives. So we benefited from some of those extra freedoms. As I say, the problem's not actually a Brexit problem per se. There's, for example, a shortage of 123,000.
I'm sorry, Minister. You're issuing 5,000 visas. Yeah.
Yeah, the 5,000.
You're issuing 5,000 visas for new HGV drivers, and you're issuing 5,500 visas for poultry workers before Christmas. Can I ask you about some of the other sectors? For instance, there's a big gap in care workers. Are they going to get visas too?
Look, as a country, we don't want to be in a situation where the solution is always to undercut the British worker, import cheaper European labour, and not skill people up. That's the whole point of levelling up, is that so we train our workers here so that people can do a decent day's work and get properly paid for it. And that's actually why we're so reticent to do those things. On the other hand, I'm not just going to stand by and watch queues forming and not respond at all. But no, in the longer term, we want to build in all the sectors, whether it's food or HGV drivers or care or elsewhere. There are 1.6 million people coming off furlough this month. We think that British people should be able to skill up and take these jobs, and we shouldn't keep undercutting people.
The poorest families in this country looking ahead are going to lose the £20 uplift in universal credit. And according to the papers this morning, they're going to lose £300 a year in higher energy bills. They're facing a really tough time. If you're not going to reverse the decision on the uplift, are you at least going to look at the details of how that is going to be implemented?
I heard you actually before I came on talking about the universal credit uplift, and as you pointed out, it was a temporary measure to help people through coronavirus whilst people weren't able to work, for example. The furlough and that support's coming to an end, but there's plenty of other support which is staying in place. For example, local housing allowance worth over £600, which was brought in for coronavirus, is staying in place. Another very good example would be the £4,000 that people on the lowest salaries now get.
I'm sorry, you know that lots of the poorest families, you know that lots of the poorest families in this country are going to have a very, very tough time this Christmas. And you know that a lot of your colleagues on the Tory backbenches are really worried about this. So I ask you again specifically, as a government, are you going to look at how this universal credit change is being implemented or not?
What we'll do is look at how the whole package of measures, everything that we do, reacts. So you mentioned about some costs that are going up, and that's undoubtedly true. Fortunately, I can also report that salaries are going up faster than that. And I think we've seen a 4.2% increase in salaries this year. We've got more people in work than even before the pandemic, and there are a million job vacancies for the first time. Yeah, a lot of people on universal credit are working, so those things are not unconnected.
That's absolutely right, but they're going to face some very, very high bills this winter, and a lot of people are very worried about that. And as a government, you could make a shift in the policy to help them, and you could say so now, but you're not.
Well, look, I'm not the Chancellor. He will have the whole package in his mind. What I am saying, though, is temporary assistance was brought in, £407 billion of assistance has been brought in for families, for individuals, for businesses. I think most people recognise if it's brought in for the pandemic, it's going to end as we move back to people going back to work in more normal times. We can't keep all of those things in place. Otherwise, as again I heard you point out, you'd have to put several pennies on income tax to pay for what is a £6 billion policy to run. So governments have to make these choices. You're right.
I'm not sure about several pennies.
It would be several pennies. I can confirm.
You've got all these measures. You've got these measures coming in. I'm so sorry. You've got these measures coming in. Will start to take effect in October and November. At Christmas, are we going to look back and think this was the moment that the government didn't act fast enough?
No, look, I think the government has, for example, with the HGV crisis, been working on this all the way through the spring and the summer, to the point where we've consulted and actually changed the laws in order to make sure that we're getting more people tested and into the sector. As I say, I think it's really important that now that package is in place with the additions that I've announced today, that people take up the opportunities of coming into the sector. I'm writing to 1 million people who have HGV licenses to ask those who are not driving at the moment to come back in, for example. And the public then also says, actually, I'm going to be sensible about this. My car's not empty, or coming closer to empty. There's no need to join one of those queues. Let everyone else go and join the queues. You can drive past because we've got plenty of petrol in this country, and we don't need to have a scare over it, because it will right itself.
No panic buying, just nonchalant buying. Grant Shapps, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Now then,
thank you.
The Brexit deal assumed that Britain would put checks on some goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But Westminster keeps kicking the can down the road, apparently sure that the EU won't retaliate by policing a hard border on the island of Ireland. It's now rumoured the British government will simply override parts of the deal it originally agreed. The EU Commissioner Mairead McGuiness joins me live from London, where this week she met the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. Mairead McGuiness, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Do you believe the British government has any intention of ever introducing checks on the border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain?
Well, good morning, Andrew. Nice to be with you. I want to put it this way. I believe that we need to trust each other, that there was an agreement made, the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, and that these agreements have to be honoured by those who signed up to them, and that includes the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. In fact, he proposed the protocol as part of the solution to a very difficult problem in relation to Northern Ireland. So I have to believe in trust, although trust has been fractured because of the delay in implementing. But let me also be very clear that the European Union has been in Northern Ireland. My colleague Maroš Šefčovič, he has listened to the real problems for businesses and communities in relation to the practical application of the protocol, and we are in solutions mode. Sure. And we will come forward with proposals to help where there are problems identified. And I would like that the UK government work with us on that journey, because we have an agreement, it will not be renegotiated, but we have to solve problems for people in Northern Ireland. We want the protocol to achieve its full ambition for Northern Ireland, total access, of course, to the UK market, but
Sure.
absolute free access to the European Union, which is an enormous market.
Now, the reason I'm asking about this is that Lord Frost, who's the minister in charge of all of this at Westminster, has said that continued negative effects on everyday life and business in Northern Ireland is being caused by the protocol. And that language is really significant because the Article 16, which allows one side to unilaterally pull out, at least for a period of time, uses very, very similar language. It says one side, plus possibly in this case the British side, acting alone, can decide to temporarily ignore parts of the deal if they're causing serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist. Now, many people think Britain is going to use that part of the deal and pull out unilaterally. If that happens, what does the EU do?
Well, let me say first that I don't think that that is the first approach. We should try and find solutions. I think threats are not helpful, and I think Article 16 is used in very extreme circumstances. It was interesting that my colleague, Vice President Šefčovič, did not get the message in Northern Ireland that they wanted the protocol to be scrapped or set aside, but people want solutions on the ground. So I don't think that's helpful. But look, we've been very pragmatic about this. We're not reacting to every comment or every, if you like, increase in temperature. What we're saying is the European Union finds solutions every day in our normal work. We can find solutions here. We want that the member states, the 27, hold together and provide solutions for Northern Ireland. And I think the one thing that's quite interesting is that the voice of Northern Ireland before the referendum, during the referendum and subsequently, in my view, has not been heard sufficiently, which was why the European Union listened carefully.
Commissioner, can I put it to you, looking at the actions of the British government, grace period after grace period after grace period, and then the talk about Article 16, they basically don't think there are any circumstances at all in which the EU side would put any kind of hard border across the island of Ireland, and therefore they can, as it were, carry on ignoring parts of the protocol. That's the truth, and what I want to hear is what your side is going to do about it.
I have to say, if that's the truth, it's a very irresponsible truth, frankly. We are all duty-bound to find solutions to the problems facing people and communities in Northern Ireland in relation to Brexit. Because I think the one word we forget to say as the problem is Brexit. The protocol is the solution, and the difficulties in its implementation can be resolved. But they can't be resolved if the atmosphere is not friendly. So I think that obviously Brexit has fragmented relationships, but we are duty-bound to get over that and to work together to find solutions. And indeed, the UK could come forward with proposals, for example, on animal and plant health. I know they've said they won't. We're not in the mood of saying, no, we're not doing anything. We've said the opposite. We're going to put forward concrete proposals, having listened to people in Northern Ireland. And I hope that the United Kingdom government and Lord Frost will believe with sincerity what we are saying. There are too many global challenges. I listened to your earlier items on energy, on skills shortages. We need to work together. We don't need to keep this divisive atmosphere, because Northern Ireland will suffer, and I think that would be reprehensible. So we are in solutions mode. We are talking directly, helping communities in Northern Ireland, and we will continue to do that.
All right. Mairead McGuiness, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you.
Now then, I'm joined for the traditional conference interview by the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, who's just arriving in his seat as we speak.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Can I start by talking about the crisis in front of the country this morning?
Yes.
Would you be bringing in foreign HGV drivers now to end this crisis?
Well, it is a complete crisis because we've got energy shortages, we've got shortages in our supermarkets, we've got prices going up, we've got taxes going up on working families,
so
and we've got the government taking away £1,000 from those that need it most.
So what do you do about it?
Well, on the HGV situation, we are going to have to bring in more drivers and more visas. And I'm astonished that the government, knowing the situation, is not acting today. The Prime Minister needs to say today what he's going to do. There are 100,000 vacancies for drivers. There are shortages. I went up the road here out of Brighton yesterday.
Right.
There are 3 petrol stations, one of them with a massive queue, 2 of them with signs saying no fuel. This is a lack of planning on behalf of the government.
All right, OK, let me ask you about the answers. Let me
finish this point, because for a long time we've known there's a problem with HGV drivers. That's been there for years. But we knew in particular that when we exited the EU, there would be a need for a backup plan to deal with the situation. And there's no plan from the government on this. And here we are, 100,000, and the government is talking about, I think, 5,000 visas.
So here we are. Would you, as Prime Minister, bring in 100,000 foreign drivers to solve this crisis?
We're going to have to do that.
So you would? The answer to that is yes.
We have to issue enough visas to cover the number of drivers that we need. The alternative,
so the
Andrew,
industry says 100,000.
If there's 100,000 vacancies for drivers in this country, and the government is saying we're going to bring in 5,000 visas, there is an obvious problem. 100,000 is, I think Norwich is 140,000. It's the size of a small city. And the government's response is far, far too small. Now, that's not an ideal response. It's a short-term response. In the long term, we need conditions to be improved. We need training. Of course we do. But the government's known that for years. And we've got a situation now where we've got an absolute crisis in this country through a lack of planning on behalf of the government.
We've also got a big problem in the food processing industry. There's 5,500 visas being issued for poultry workers, for instance. Would you give them visas too?
Well, Andrew, we can't sit here and in relation to each of these issues say we're going to simply allow these industries, these sectors to go to the wall. That is not fair. This is a complete lack of planning. We exited the EU. One consequence was there was going to be a shortage of HGV drivers. That was predictable. It was predicted. And here we are on Sunday. So I say to the Prime Minister, we need a concrete plan today to deal with this problem, because otherwise this is going to go on till Christmas. And I'll tell you one other thing, Andrew. If we bring in the army, then they will have to come in. They will not want to go in for the long term.
Okay.
All of the army deployments tell me over and over again, if they have to step in a crisis, as they do sometimes, they do not want to be locked in for the long term.
You talked about the petrol stations. Similarly, if you walk up almost any high street in Britain a few weeks ago, you'd see little signs outside the restaurants saying kitchen staff urgently needed. And now many of those same restaurants have closed because of shortage of staff. Would you do the same thing for this huge shortage of hospitality staff in this country? Would you allow people to come in and get those restaurants and those pubs open again?
We need to encourage people into hospitality because there is that problem. There are different ways of achieving that, and one of the propositions we've put on the table is how you get people back into those jobs. But Andrew, my central...
I'm sorry to jump in, but drivers, poultry workers, hospitality workers, presumably also people in care homes and agriculture, this is beginning to sound a little bit like free movement.
No, it's beginning to sound like a complete lack of planning, a complete lack of planning. And it's beginning to sound like a complete lack of planning because it is a lack of planning. We took the decision to leave the EU in 2016. So we've had 5 years for the government to work through the consequences. And here we are on a Sunday morning with petrol stations closed or massive queues, with supermarkets that have got shelves that are empty, total lack of planning, and a Prime Minister who cannot take key decisions.
Let's move on from the Prime Minister. Your theme this week is very much working people. The government is introducing a 1.25 pence in the pound increase in national insurance to help the NHS and social care. Would you repeal that?
Well, Andrew, it is wrong to bring that in. It is whacking working people, and we have said
would you repeal
our alternative would be that those with the broadest shoulders pay. The Prime Minister had a choice on how he taxed this.
I'm still looking for an answer. Would you repeal it?
Well, we will, when we get to the election, we will set out our stall. But we have set out principles today. We've set out fiscal rules. On top of that, hear me out, Andrew, because it's very important to your question, which is that one of our tax principles, one of our tax rules, is that we will not, when we tax, unfairly burden working people. And that is what the government is doing with this rise.
I'm sorry, it's getting difficult, because if you say it's an absolute principle that this rise breaches, you can't tell me that you're going to repeal it. Surely, if it breaches one of your fundamental principles, you would repeal it.
We've said it's wrong. We've set out what the alternative is, which is to ensure that those with the broadest shoulders pay for this rise. We've set out that that should include those that get their income from property, from stocks and shares and dividends. We've made that case. That is a big divide now politically. The government wants to hit working families. We say it should be those with the broadest shoulders. I know the Tories don't like that divide, but that is now the divide.
So if you're going to repeal that and get rid of it, there's a 12 or so billion pound hole to fill from somewhere. You've said this morning, your Shadow Chancellor has said this morning that Labour will not be increasing income tax, period. Is that right?
She said we're not considering increasing income tax, or she's not at the moment. What we've said, Andrew...
Is that a weasel word suddenly put in there?
No. What we have done, which I don't think any leader of the opposition has done this far out from election, is to set out our fiscal rules, which is we'll pay for day-to-day spending, we will borrow to invest, and we will bring down debt as a share of our economy. So we've set out our rules. We are looking at tax. Nothing is off the table, but Andrew, we don't know what the state of the national finances will be as we go into the election, and nor does anyone else.
I'm not asking for a detailed policy now, I promise, but...
Well, don't ask me to write our manifesto on your show.
I'm not asking you to do that either, but I am asking for the principles. So you're not in favour of taxing working people more, you're not in favour of income tax, but you yourself have just mentioned share income and presumably income from people who have properties that they're renting.
Andrew, you're putting
those kinds of things going to be taxed more heavily, or at least at the same rate as income?
You're putting words in my mouth. I've not said anything about income tax. What I've said is the principle is that we will not unfairly hit working families. That's the principle. But Andrew, we are 2-3 years from an election. We do not know the state of the national finances. We have set out fiscal rules. This is the approach we'll take. Tax principles, and we will apply those to the situation we face going into the election.
The Shadow Chancellor can tell the Sunday Times that you are not going to raise income tax, but the leader of the Labour Party sitting here can't repeat those words.
You're trying to find a division that isn't there.
So you will not include...
What Rachel Reeves said is she's not currently considering income tax, and that is fine. Okay. But what I am saying is, as we go into the election, we will apply the principles that we have set out to the situation as it arises. What we don't want to do, whether it's income tax or any other sort of tax, national insurance, is unfairly to hit working families, which is what this government is doing. And it's a political choice.
Are you going towards a wealth tax of some kind? You've used the word yourself in the past.
Just look at the political choice that the government is making.
Not the government, you. Are you looking at a wealth tax?
Look at the choice the government is making. Under their provision, under their tax they announced just the other week, those with many properties as landlords don't pay a penny more. Their working tenants do. And Andrew, we've said...
Let's return, in that case, if we may, to the current crisis, which is an energy and fuel crisis, £300 on average fuel bills this winter, and so on. Will you nationalise the big 6 energy companies?
Well, the immediate problem with the energy companies is how we ensure the supply of energy through the winter and into next year, and to do that without raising the prices for working people.
So that is an immediate issue.
That is the immediate problem.
But I'm asking you a big principled question. Will you nationalise the big 6 energy companies, yes or no?
No.
No, you will not. This is what you said as part of your 10 pledges. Public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders. Support common ownership of rail, mail, energy and winter. You promised that 18 months ago, and now you're saying no. Why?
I don't see nationalisation there. There is
what else does public hands mean?
There's a world... Well, public services should be in public hands. But when it comes to something like energy, we've got an immediate problem in the next few months that we've got to solve. And then when it comes to common ownership, I'm pragmatic about this. I do not agree with the argument that says we must be ideological. Look what happened.
So what does common ownership mean if it doesn't mean nationalisation?
Look what happens when we're ideological about this. Track and trace put into private sector £37 billion when we were arguing it would be better in the public sector with local authorities. So I'd be pragmatic about it, and where common ownership is value for money for the taxpayer and delivers better services, then there should be common ownership.
Poor Ed Miliband believed you when you said that, and he was asked on Newsnight just the other day about this exactly, and he said, we're in favour of common ownership, absolutely. Wait for the conference, but Keir Starmer said in his leadership campaign he was in favour of public ownership. We haven't changed that commitment. Maybe we haven't, but you have.
Andrew, I've just set out the principles we will apply. We're not going to be ideological. I'm going to be pragmatic.
I'm
going to be
what
pragmatic. Well, let me spell it out. What that means is that where common ownership is value for money for the taxpayer and delivers a better service, then I'm in favour of common ownership. An example I would give is track, trace and isolate, because the government took an ideological position to put it out to the private sector.
We're veering off to the government again. I'm still trying to...
Well, I'm
still
giving
trying
you
to
an
understand
example.
actually what you would do for the energy companies. If you're not going to nationalise them and the ownership is going to be changed, what happens? Who owns it and how?
£37 billion later on track and trace in the private sector, and it should have been in the public sector with our local authorities. When it comes to common ownership, we will apply those principles going into the election.
Listen, if you have said that and you can't stand by it 18 months later on, how can you ever say that Boris Johnson is breaking promises and accuse him of breaking election promises if you've broken that one?
Well, Andrew, I've explained the situation, the principles we will apply to energy or any other sector, and we will apply it. It's common sense. If it's value for the taxpayer and it delivers a better public service, then we would be in favour of common ownership.
Does someone who thinks only women have a cervix is welcome in the Labour Party?
Well, look, Andrew, we need to have a mature, respectful debate about trans rights, and we need to, I think, bear in mind that the trans community are amongst, the most marginalised and abused communities, and wherever we've got to on the law, we need to go further, and we want to go further on that. But whatever the debate is, it needs to be a tolerant debate, and I am absolutely sure that our conference will be a place which is safe for that debate to take place, and it is.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right. But, Andrew, I don't think that...
So Rosie Duffield should not have said that. Can you explain to people watching why she should not have said that?
Well, Andrew, I don't think that we can just go through various things that people have said. Rosie Duffield, I spoke to Rosie earlier this week and told her that conference was a safe place for her to come, and it is a safe place for her to come. And I spoke to others to make exactly the same principle. We do everybody a disservice when we reduce what is a really important issue to these exchanges on particular things that are said. The trans community are, as I say, the most marginalised and abused of many, many communities, and we need to make progress on the Gender Recognition Act.
You could say that exchanges is how humans communicate and resolve these things.
Yeah, but Andrew, this debate is... I am very concerned that this debate needs to be conducted in a proper way in which proper views are expressed, in a way that is respectful.
Sure. You've spoken to Rosie Duffield, we've spoken to Rosie Duffield. After your conversation, she still doesn't feel comfortable about coming to this Labour Party conference. What does that say about the Labour Party?
Well, Andrew, I spoke to Rosie just earlier this week and made it absolutely clear to her that this is a safe conference for her to come to.
She doesn't agree with that.
Well, Andrew, I spoke to her, and what she said... What she said to me was that she didn't want to come because it was cause a distraction from the ideas that we're putting forward at this conference. And I asked her when I spoke to her whether that was something I could say on her behalf, and she said yes. So that's what Rosie says about this, and I'll take that from Rosie.
OK, she said to us that she didn't feel comfortable. You've talked quite a lot about respectful debate and calm conversation. Let me read you something that was said here yesterday. We cannot get any worse than a bunch of scum, homophobic, racist, misogynistic, absolute pile of Banana Republic, Etonian, piece of scum, and I held back a little, that I have ever seen in my life. That was Angela Rayner, your deputy, last night. What's your message to her this morning?
Well, Andrew and I take different approaches, and that is not language that I would use.
Should she apologise?
Well, look, Angela said those words. She takes a different approach to me. We have different approaches to how we get our messages across. It's not language that I would have used.
You're a courteous man. Do you think she should apologise?
Well, look, that's a matter for Angela, Andrew, but I would not have used those words. And it goes back
so
to
what are you going to say
my
to her
central
about
point about the respectful way in which we have a debate. But look, at conference, there's a fizz of ideas, there are rallies.
That wasn't mighty respectful, was it?
Well, there are a fizz of ideas, There are arguments, disagreements, comings together. And what I focus on, Andrew, is, look, we started this interview talking about the absolute crisis in the country. And working families up and down the country are going to ask the question, there must be an alternative to this. And our conference is our chance to set out that alternative. And that is what we're going to do.
All right, once more with feeling, what are you going to say to her?
Well, I wouldn't have used those words. And I will talk to Angela about it later on.
Do you think she should apologise?
Well, look, that's a matter for Angela. I would not have used those words.
Let's turn on to this very, very complicated discussion, argument about the party rules. There's almost nobody at this party conference who doesn't think that this rule change is designed to stop Jeremy Corbyn or somebody like Jeremy Corbyn ever becoming leader of the Labour Party again. Is that true?
No, Andrew, I have said repeatedly what the purpose of the rules is. By the way, I'm very happy with the situation we're in now, because I've got a package of rule changes that does what I wanted them to do, which is to ensure that the Labour Party can focus on the country, and some of those rules were holding us back. So I'm very happy with the situation we find ourselves in. It's a strong package, went through the Executive Committee yesterday, it's going to the floor of conference today. There's almost nobody in the Labour Party who doesn't say we need to change the rules. What people have been saying is it would be better to delay it. I think to delay it and not take a difficult decision is weakness. I think strong leadership requires tough decisions to be taken quickly.
And just coming back to my Jeremy Corbyn point, Momentum says this, you may have heard this quote, I don't know. If the 20% threshold applied to the 2020 leadership election, it would have been a contest between Sir Keir Starmer QC and Sir Keir Starmer QC. Can you see why people think this is a bit of a stitch-up?
Yeah, but Andrew, it doesn't work like that, does it? Because as soon as you have a different percentage, then behaviour changes amongst MPs. So I don't think that example works. But I go back to my central point, and let me just make good why it's so important. In 2019, many of our MPs spent months in their constituencies worried about whether they were going to be deselected, instead of out-facing the country. I need to turn the Labour Party from where we were in 2019 into a party that is facing the country and able to win a general election. And I need everybody facing the country. So I'm very pleased with this package. It suits my central aim, and I very much hope that we can get it through. And Andrew, I'll tell you what, I'd take 3 days of arguing about rule changes and get them through than do what everybody else is saying, which is put it off for another 12 months. The last thing I want is another 12 months arguing about these rules when if we get them through, we can then set on, face the country and set out what we're saying. And look at what we have been saying this week. Strong stuff on housing, strong stuff on employment rights yesterday, strong stuff on education
today.
Let me
ask you about education, actually, since you've raised this question. 1.7 billion, you hope that you can raise by removing the charitable status of private schools. Now, there are very, very rich private schools, and there are private schools slightly on the edge. If this change means that some private schools go under, is it worth it?
Well, look, Andrew, it's a political choice.
Yeah.
And what I want to ensure that we ensure that every child going through the state system has the chance to come out with the skills for life and the skills for work. And that is what this money is going to be used for. 40% or so of those leaving school don't have the qualifications they need to take them on coming out of state schools. I'm not going to walk around that problem. People have been walking around that problem for too long. So this is a political choice to take that money and switch it to our state schools so that children and young people in our state schools have the best chance they can have to come out of schools ready for life, ready for work.
You've been leader for 18 months now. Now, I know a lot of that, in fact, all of it has been during the pandemic. But why is it that after all that time, you are still having to introduce yourself to voters?
Well, Andrew, we have had the pandemic, and that has been difficult. A lot of the time I've been leader, I've been either in restrictions and therefore not able to get out, or we've had the rule of 6, which means that until recently, if I met anybody indoors, I had to do it with a mask on, and I could only meet 5 people. But, you know, we've gone from an election where people wouldn't hear us, they wouldn't give us the time of day. Last year, I said in my conference speech, listen again, give us another hearing. We're now getting that. I've been out for months over the summer talking to people who don't vote Labour. I haven't been talking to people who vote Labour, people who don't vote Labour across the country, and they are open They're prepared to give us a hearing. So what this conference gives us is a great opportunity, actually, to set out our case, to set out and people have said, where are your policies? Hard-edge policy on housing that tackles some of the underlying issues that have been there for a long time. Hard-edge policy on employment yesterday.
And
in education today.
Let's stick on you
and I'm
rather
yet,
than
to make
hard-edge
I'm yet to make my speech.
All right. If one talks to a wide range of your colleagues, a similar picture seems to come through. They almost all say, Sir Keir Starmer, honest as the day is long, punctilious, hard-working, thoroughly decent. But in the end, he's not really a politician. He hasn't got the oomph, the edge to cut through in those big seats. And these are days when you need someone who's a bit of a showman, who can really let rip, who can show who they are emotionally, and you're not that man.
Well, look, Andrew, the idea, people put the argument to me, they say, what you need these days is that showman. And it's...
A bit of it.
No, just a minute. A showman. And what a great thing about Boris Johnson is his showman. It's priced in, apparently, that he's dishonest. Priced in. Just stop there and ask ourselves, do we want our politics and our political leaders and our Prime Minister to be of a characteristic where they're untrustworthy and where it's priced in that they're dishonest? I'm different, I'm afraid. I believe in integrity, I believe in truth, and I also, when I look across the country, I see different leaders. Mark Drakeford in Wales has just come back with our best or second best result in Wales. He's got a very different approach, honest, reassuring and transparent. So the argument that you've got to be a showman
Some of your colleagues are saying that this conference is your last chance. And if you don't really cut through and the numbers don't start moving after this conference, then for the good of the party, you should do what very few Labour leaders do. For the good of the party, stand aside, because you're not going to be able to beat Boris Johnson at the next election. And you should be big enough to do that. Andrew, what do you say to them?
Andrew, I've just taken a tough decision in relation to rule changes because I didn't want to delay. And a tough, strong leader takes tough decisions when they arise and doesn't dither and put them to one side. I'm about to make my speech on Wednesday, and that is an opportunity for me to set out where I think this country needs to go next and what the alternative is to this government, which is in chaos, and we're going to see that over the course of the next months.
Keir Starmer, we've covered a lot of ground. Thanks very much indeed for talking to me this morning. Now then, if you're interested in Labour politics, and I'm sure you are, you will want to watch this.
Gordon and I were as close as two people could be in politics.
We had this shared ideal that we could create a Labour Party that was once again capable of winning elections.
When it was good, we were unbeatable.
They had a huge mutual respect.
Gordon and Tony had different visions of New Labour.
In the end, that's politics.
Blair and Brown, the New Labour Revolution. Starts Monday, the 4th of October on BBC Two and iPlayer.
And as promised, Adam Fleming's back here. He was listening to that interview with Keir Starmer. There's lots we could talk about, Adam, but it was really interesting that he wouldn't go quite as far as his shadow chancellor on income tax.
Yeah, let's do another hour, Andrew. Yeah, we're seeing the classic growing pains of a new fiscal policy being generated in the opposition, in that if you listen to Rachel Reeves, she says no income tax. You listen to Keir Starmer, he's keeping the option open. So it raises the question of who will be writing the policy come the next election.
Is this a big hinge moment in Labour politics, though? When you look at his new her new fiscal rules, because they're not yet his fiscal rules completely, and what they're saying about tax, and edging towards higher taxes possibly for people on share income, we're edging towards a wealth tax. This feels like quite a big shift from the earlier years.
Well, let's be honest, we'll have to wait for the details, because you can't work out what they're going to tax until you know exactly what they're going to spend, and that's still quite a long way off, unfortunately. Yeah. I think what is interesting, though, and what will enrage a lot of activists here, is that comprehensive rejection of Jeremy Corbyn's nationalisation of the utilities and the public services. Corbyn was going to do nationalise broadband, power, water, energy, very popular here amongst the activists. All Keir Starmer says that he would bring into public ownership is test and trace, which we're probably not going to need in 10 years' time.
Indeed. Not surprisingly, Keir Starmer didn't enjoy the Angela Rayner quote being read back to him. She said that she's not going to apologise until Boris Johnson apologises, and he hasn't made it clear whether he thinks she should apologise. Where are we on all of that? It's a great First day of conference story, certainly.
Keir Starmer is not able to say to Angela Rayner, you should apologise for these comments, even though he himself would not have made them. Is that because he doesn't have the strength to tell Angela Rayner to do that? Is that because she has...
He knows what she'd say, maybe?
She has her own mandate, directly elected by the party? Or is it because actually it's quite useful to have a wingwoman who can say the stuff that he can't say?
Wingwoman, great word. Adam Fleming, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Time has now beaten us, I'm afraid, here in Brighton. Thanks to all my guests this morning. I will be here at 9 o'clock on Sunday when I'll be speaking, not here, of course, I'll be up north speaking to the Prime Minister next week, so stay tuned. There's more politics here on BBC One across the UK, but from me, from here, for now, goodbye.